Welcome everyone to First Tuesdays with Heart. It is Tuesday, September 2020. Excuse me, 2nd, 2025. I think I'm in shock that it's September already. First Tuesdays is sponsored by the Heart Peer Support Team in connection with the Resiliency and Justice Center in Las Vegas. HEART stands for Healing, Empowering, and Rebuilding Together. We're a peer support program for anyone impacted by any mass violence incident. So I want to take a quick minute to introduce our Heart team. Alice, who was just speaking, is a licensed professional counselor, and she's also a certified professional coach. She is the co-director of Heart, and she also facilitates the UNLV and Route 91 support groups. Jackie, who is actually probably in the air right now, is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She is the behavioral health program coordinator for the Resiliency and Justice Center. She is one of our original Heart coaches, and she facilitates the Route 91 and continuing the conversation with Heart support groups. And I'm Jill Winter. I'm co-director of Heart. I am a Route 91 survivor. I assist Alice with the UNLV support group, and I co-facilitate the continuing the conversation with Heart support groups with Jackie. So we always like to start with a meme that kind of has to do with something with tonight's presentation. And I know we've shared this one before, but I think it's so important because we never know what somebody's going through. If people look at us, they don't know that we've had a lot of trauma with our incident. So it's always important to be kind no matter what you see with a person. So tonight we are thrilled to have Jesse Arias with us. Jesse graduated from the University of South Carolina with a bachelor's degree in psychology. He believes in advocating for mental health and community resources for individuals to improve their quality of life. Prior to becoming the director of the Orlando United Resiliency Services, he worked closely with veterans as a case manager in the Supportive Services for Veterans and Families program that prevents the end of homelessness. Jesse is now the director of the Orlando United Resiliency Center Services, a program which is under the LGBTQ plus Center of Orlando. He's been with ours since May of 2017, working as a case manager, assisting those directly and indirectly impacted by the Pulse tragedy. He's continued to partner with the LGBT plus community as an ally, where his goal is to help support those who've been marginalized. In serving the Pulse community, Jesse was able to witness the far-reaching effects of mass violence and now strives to broaden his role as a community advocate by bringing awareness of trauma and how it impacts everyone. Jesse continues to work with his Hours colleagues where they implement trauma-informed practices in a case management setting and continue to listen to the needs of community and its survivors. Some of Jesse's life enjoyments include things like traveling the world, Premier League soccer, being out on the ocean, and environmental conservation.
Okay, so I wanted to, when Alice and Jill approached me in regards to some of the topics that we can discuss, I took a little bit of time in trying to figure out, what has been really helpful for people who have experienced mass violence or survivors or families of some of the victims. And some of the things that I have learned throughout the years, it's it it I don't think it no longer surprises me how much trauma comes up in conversation with a lot of our clients, even when we're not talking about mass violence, even when I am helping out our day to day here at the center of Orlando, clients, just people in the community. And it's something that's so prevalent, but it's also misunderstood. And sometimes we don't understand how far-reaching trauma can be. And so when Jill and Alice approached me, I thought about this topic as one of the most important topics that I think, in my opinion, will hopefully educate some of y'all, or if not, it might be something that we revisit. So today we're going to talk a little bit about trauma, grief, and loss, and understanding how all those three intersect and where do they meet, because when we think about them as separate, they are different, but at some point they do intersect and they can create something different. And for people that are experiencing grief. So let me do. So what is trauma? I know that as I mentioned before, trauma gets mentioned a lot, especially in movies and now in podcasts and in videos. But trauma is a little bit more than just PTSD, or sometimes when we see like in movies like the veteran who goes to war and has flashbacks once they come back, and people tend to think that things like trauma or PTSD only affect veterans or someone who has experienced something incredibly violent. But trauma is pretty prevalent, even when children are younger. And even if I've had clients who've said to me, hey, I've lived a pretty good life, I don't understand why I would be traumatized or feeling or experiencing trauma. But when we start looking at things like neglect or abandonment, or some of those more subtle things that people don't really see as negative or dangerous, but trauma does appear. So trauma is the psychological and emotional, and it's sometimes a physical injury that occurs when a person experiences an event that is overwhelming, life-threatening, or deeply distressing. And one of the key things here is, yes, trauma can occur when someone experiences a disturbing event and it causes some sort of emotional disturbance. The key thing to think about here, from what we have understood, it's perception is reality. So if a child or an adult or an individual perceives the event to be threatening or dangerous or harmful, it can be traumatizing. So it's very subjective. And sometimes we tend to think about trauma being very objective. This, if you got hit by a car, oh, that's got to be traumatizing. But it really depends on the individual and some of the coping mechanisms or coping skills that they have and how they internalize that event. Whether they're going to perceive it as traumatizing, whether they're going to perceive it as just a singular event, something negative that happened to them, but they're able to cope or move on from that. So typically trauma, it's the way that I think about trauma, it's almost as if our, when we think about our alarm system, like the amygdala that we have in our brain, which pretty much handles our flight, fight, or freeze responses that help us survive. It's pretty instinctual. And a lot of the times, the way that I think about it is trauma kind of breaks the switch, or it just consistently lets that thing misfire or fire at certain intervals or certain events or certain smells or at certain moments, and causes people to feel that they are in danger when they're really not. They may be in a safe space, they may be around friends or loved ones, but for some reason, that hypervigilance, that sense of safety has been taken away, that sense of security. So what we see a lot is our individuals who are experiencing trauma, sometimes the sense of safety is no longer there. It's something that we have to work towards and try to instill that sense of security and safety, not only physically and in our environment, but internally in our physical and emotional bodies. So trauma can, affect the way that a person thinks, feels, or perceives the world, right? If you are in constant state of hypervigilance, or you're paranoid because you've experienced trauma, you're going to perceive the world as this very dangerous, mistrustful, distrustful place. Even trying to engage in community or social settings can be an issue, can be really, really difficult for some of us. Some of the other symptoms or signs of trauma are people when they have, flashbacks or memories or intrusive thoughts, intrusive feelings. Intrusive thoughts and intrusive feelings are basically having these ideas or these thoughts that we don't necessarily want to have. We want to stop thinking about them, but for some reason we can't stop thinking. And that is a way of the brain trying to overcompensate, of not letting that guard down, that sense of safety down again. Because if you let it go, if you forget it, if you don't pay attention to it constantly, it's going to happen again. So it's literally, quite literally, the body's still stuck. There are different types of trauma. And I think for today, the purpose of understanding what trauma is will help us kind of understand where trauma and grief intersect and why it happens, and sometimes why it's longer lasting than other events or for other people. So acute trauma, just to differentiate between some of the trauma, acute trauma is when someone experiences one event. So it's a singular event. Let's say perhaps someone was once again crossing the street and a vehicle hit their loved one, and unfortunately the person died and they witnessed all that. That is a single incident or an event that can be traumatizing. Chronic trauma is when it's repeated, it's prolonged, such as in like domestic violence or abuse, and even in war. So it's this long period of this traumatic experience of experiences repeated over and over. And then finally, when we talk about complex trauma is typically thought of as developmental trauma. It's that trauma that children will sometimes experience when there's an attachment disorder. Perhaps it's typically found in childhood. Let's say a young child doesn't develop a healthy relationship with his or her caregiver or parent. That consistent, multi-layered relationship, along with other events that are potentially traumatizing, can develop into complex trauma. And the reason why it's important to, the reason why I really wanted to highlight these differences is because when it comes to treatment, when it comes to healing, when it comes to moving forward, understanding that there are several, understanding how many layers could there be to this trauma? How many layers could there be to my healing? And the thing is that if it's an acute trauma, yes, there's a singular event that a therapist or treatment can help you kind of isolate and focus on. But when it's complex, it's usually oftentimes more severe. So it requires a little bit more work. And I'm not ever going to say that there isn't hope. There's hope for everyone who ever goes to treatment. I'm a firm believer in that. But to understand that complex trauma is multi-layered, so it's almost like we're having to kind of peel back the layer of onions and like try to figure out what is at the core of our trauma and our certain events that we've experienced. So what is grief? Grief is pretty much the natural emotional and physical, cognitive, and behavioral response to a significant loss, such as the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, a serious illness, or job loss. Grief is basically, when I think about grief, the way that grief is defined is grief is the emotional reaction that we have to a loss when we are trying to adapt and perceive that loss throughout time. That is grief. That is grieving. So one of the things that sometimes people can confuse is they think that grief is just, oh, you're just sad. No, grief is more than that, is a full body experience in the sense that your chemistry changes, your whole mood can change. It takes time. Grief takes a long time. It can take time, and everyone's grief is very, very different. Grief isn't linear, and oftentimes I've heard people say, I've had clients who have been told to get over it, and that is one of the most taboo things that some of our clients can hear is, hey, it's been, I hear it. I still hear it from people in the community, especially from here in Pulse, who have experienced the Pulse tragedy. They have been told, hey, it's been 9 years, you're still not over it. And that is a complete disservice to people who went through some horrific event. And it's not as simple as just getting over it. If people really wanted that, I'm sure that some people could, but some people don't want to. Some people want to be able to grieve and honor whoever they lost because they don't want to forget them. They want to love them even if they are not here. That is part of the relationship that is built through grief and healing. So some of the things that involve grief or acute grief as soon as it happens is it can involve, some shock or numbness, anger, guilt, or despair when grief does occur. And granted, if quote unquote, normal grief, I'm also going to call it uncomplicated grief, because while normal grief sounds like, I don't want to offend anyone, but typically, I guess the more typical sense of grieving is being able to accept the reality or accept the loss. And you're still going to feel that sense of sadness and guilt and anger. But as I'll continue to talk, I'll be able to highlight the differences where grief starts to take a turn to something else, especially when we start to integrate it with trauma, and how that can affect our psyche and can affect our mental health and basically the prognosis of everything. So grief is unique to everyone. Everyone grieves in a very unique way. And it is, once again, it's a normal process that helps us cope with and adapt to a certain loss. I've had people tell me that whenever they're grieving, we have a saying here, we say what comes up comes up. And that means that for us, we may be grieving and all of a sudden it may be 6 months down the line, or maybe even 2 years, and all of a sudden we might be in the kitchen, washing some dishes, and maybe we catch a scent of something, or maybe a song comes on, and all of a sudden we're just flooded with these emotions, and it's sadness that overcomes us. And that's okay. That's normal. That is part of the healing journey, that sometimes these things can bring up the memories of our loved ones. So and being able to understand that there is no shame in that. And we'll talk a little bit more about where complicated grief and trauma and all that, there are some shameful, people sometimes will feel weak or invalidated in those regards when they feel those kind of things, because they think to themselves, wait, it's been this long, I should have gotten over my grief. So there are different types of grief. There is anticipatory grief, where we see this a lot. And let's say, for example, an individual who has been taking care of their family. I've had clients who have taken care of their loved ones for 20 years, or some for 10 years. And it's a lot of visits to the hospital, or it's a lot of missed trips or missed outings and holidays, because yes, they're busy taking care of their loved ones, and they would never go back and undo it. They always say, no, I would never change anything about that. But once that individual passes away, even though they knew that the individual perhaps had a terminal illness or a terminal diagnosis, the idea that anticipatory grief can start early on, even before the individual has passed. And so sometimes understanding this emotional journey that we go through as humans, and when we share this universal connection like grief, emotion, we can sense that loss even before it happens, even before that person is gone physically. And so, or mentally even, or cognitively, I should say. So sometimes we will anticipate literally that loss, and we might feel that sense of grief coming on early and then after as well. So, and the reason why I bring that up too is because sometimes as we experience grief or we experience loss, people will say to us, but didn't you know that they were going to die? And that is a disservice, right? Because no, it doesn't matter. It was my father, it was my mother, it was my sister, it was my coworker, and they still passed away. It still matters to me. It's still hurtful. It's painful. So understanding and being able to pinpoint it and put a label on it is also part of a lot of this validation process that we do with grieving. Disenfranchised grief is basically grief that, so I'm sorry, to move on to the other type of grief. Disenfranchised grief is grief that is not openly acknowledged, and it's not socially validated by our peers or publicly mourned. When I think about disenfranchised grief, I'll touch a little bit more later on the Pulse community, but it was not unheard of for some of our survivors who experienced the Pulse nightclub tragedy. It wasn't unheard of for them to go back to work. And some people weren't necessarily out with their sexuality to their coworkers. But some of the comments that people would get was, well, they're gay, so they deserved it. Or sometimes the hetero community will really disenfranchised will invalidate the experiences of the LGBTQ community as thinking as it's almost as if the loss is lesser than. But that's not the case. That can't be further away from the truth. And so other examples of disenfranchised grief is things like an unhappy marriage. Sometimes we may have someone who was in an unhappy marriage for 10 years or 15 years, and people around them knew about this. But all of a sudden, this partner or significant other or spouse passes away. And people think, why are you sad? Why are you upset? Well, you were married to that individual. You had an attachment, you had a life together. And sometimes that grief can be invalidated by our own peers and even our own family members. And I don't think their intentions are to hurt. I just think people logically don't understand that even if you are in an unhappy marriage, that loss still happens. And it's that concept of adapting to that loss, even without the individual, and being able to process that. Collective grief is when a community shares a response to this grief when something happens. So a community, a society, or a nation to a significant loss of tragedy, such as things like a natural disaster, the war, a pandemic, an act of mass violence, right? Sometimes when these acts of mass violence have happened, there has been the community mourns. The community, I know the response here in Orlando, as much as I hate what happened, the response in Orlando was an overwhelmingly positive one, despite some of the negatives. We saw rainbow flags everywhere. We saw restaurants and businesses putting up, this is a safe space with rainbow flags. And it really called to action the community. But even though I was not close to Pulse, even though I didn't know anyone at Pulse when that first happened, when you walked into work that next day, almost 10 years ago, it was a somber, sad mood. It didn't matter if I didn't know anyone there. It was a very impacting, saddening event or tragedy, I should say, that we were all affected by it. So in that sense, collective grief is also another type of grief that does exist. And just understanding that sometimes we might be able to bond with other people in that regards when there is a collective grief, if they understand what that is like, and it can promote a sense of community. But when you are not in that community and then you miss out on that, it could also it could also make people feel a little bit isolated. I know that despite for some people having been survivors of a mass violence event, even when it's different, sometimes it's been hard for them. Like, I've met other people from other sites and they've come here, but they still feel like they're not entitled to some of the services because it's only for Pulse. It's only for the Pulse community. But I'm like, no, you're in the exact place. Like, absolutely not. You're more than welcome to come here. It's not just about Pulse. It's for everyone. It's for, so I'm going to, but that's all on collective grief. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what loss is. So loss is the actual event of losing something or someone significant. So when we talk about, grief and we talk about loss, we often think about death. We often think about death loss. We lost someone who died. But sometimes losses can also be very symbolic, or they can also be attached to an event that happened objectively, something that truly happened when it refers to the thing that caused that loss. Some of the things that when we talk about non-death loss, we talk about things like loss in regards to a body part or limb, or we talk about a job, our sense of community, our identity. Sometimes we've had people grieve in a workplace whenever someone, perhaps they're transitioning, they're trans and they're transitioning. Sometimes people in an office will grieve that individual because, you know, now they're getting to meet a different version, or they're not version, but they're getting to meet someone, you know, their authentic selves for the first time, but they still had a relationship with the person before that. So that is, in a way, even though there is no one that is dying physically, it's that symbolic loss that we also experience. So understanding that we can also grieve these non-death losses is also very important to understanding basically the ripple effect of all these other primary and secondary losses that I'll touch on in a little bit. Losses typically can be perceived as something negative and upsetting, and they're still very painful. So in no way do we think that losses are something to just move on or overcome and just get over it. No, losses are also important to be grieved. It's necessary. It's part of the mourning. It's part of our tasks of mourning. It's part of that journey and process with grief. So when we also, one way to think about losses is when it's actual versus when it's perceived. So I kind of touched on a little bit as to what the actual loss is. So for example, an actual loss is typically a death loss, or, you know, we lost a body part, or we lost an object like a ring, or something that we were very emotionally tied to. The perceived loss is when we lose almost like that symbolic relationship, or like I mentioned earlier, the loss of our identity, the loss of our independence, or the loss of a relationship with a friend. So those are some of the those are perceived losses. When we talk about what our primary loss, we're really talking about that thing, the thing that is kind of like the main loss that we've experienced. So is the initial loss of a person, a thing, or an attribute? So for example, let's say if my father, God forbid, passed away, then that would be my primary loss. In that loss, there's almost like a ripple effect when primary losses happen. And the ripple effect happens what we call secondary losses. So with the primary loss, we have things that are called secondary losses. And secondary losses are basically all the other losses that come as a consequence to that primary loss. So just to explain it a little bit better. When we talk about the person that we have lost, we also have a loss of, perhaps that person was our breadwinner in our family. Perhaps that person was the one who brought in a lot of the income for us to be able to feed and put food on the table. Some of the other secondary losses are, oftentimes I hear people, when someone passes away, that those social relationships, those social connections, those friendships that they had together with those other individuals no longer exist. It was that person that was tying them to that community. And that is a secondary loss. Sometimes some of the other secondary losses that people can experience are a loss of faith, a loss of confidence. You probably, if your significant other passed away, one of the secondary losses could be if you dreamed of a life together and you no longer have that, there's no longer that dream with them. So that comes as a secondary loss. And that's important to understand. One of the, and it could be things as simple as, well, what I've heard from our community members is, they'll say, well, my husband, when he would come home, he was the one that would switch out all the light bulbs in the house. And now I don't have anyone to do that because I can't get up on the stool or the ladder to do it. And when we have that primary loss, when the individual passes away, the secondary losses come by, where it's like perhaps they were the ones that did all the housework. They were the ones that fixed everything inside the house. And so it's important to understand the role that plays in us adapting to a new reality. So I want to take a second and invite, everyone who is here today, what are some of the secondary losses that, if you don't, I would love to hear some of your stories, or excuse me, some of your secondary losses that you might have experienced. And, if you're willing to share, if not, that's okay. But perhaps we can, just kind of touch on that for a second. Okay, I love that. I see that Alice,
Oh,
sense of
no.
self.
I am a survivor from Route 91 shooting. But I recently went through a divorce. My husband turned into somebody else, got on drugs, and left us. He was the breadwinner of the family. And now sorry, I got my TV on. Hold on a second. Let me mute it. I feel like I'm mourning him because the person he was doesn't exist anymore. And I miss him very much.
Mhm.
He was there for me through the shooting. He was a good dad and a good husband. And now he's not that person anymore.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm mourning him, even though he's still alive.
Mhm.
You're
Mhm.
mourning who he
Um,
used to be.
yeah,
So it's
yeah,
not who he currently is, but it's who he was.
yeah. And I still
Which
have
is
all my
hard.
pictures on the wall of when he was healthy and good, and he was a good man. He was a good dad. And I miss that very much. Um, I lost my mom during COVID. It's the hardest thing I've ever gone through in my life. I'm still having trouble with it. And now that our anniversary is coming up, I've just been so emotional. And then I have other people reach out to me because they're going through the anniversary effect as well. And I try to be
Mhm.
supportive and stuff, but half the time I just want to cry
Yeah,
because we shouldn't have to be going through this,
I hear
you
you.
know?
I hear you. And Tara, I'm really sorry about your mom. I'm really sorry to hear that I can't imagine what that's been like for you. Uh, and also, yes, the loss of your husband, the identity of who he was. That is something that, you know, in the present, that's what I'm trying to highlight, is some of that is the ripple effect of things that happen, right? It's really these acts of violence, they really do permeate into our lives. And what we find out, unfortunately, is yes, these things are horrible, right? Because in the sense, they affect so many other aspects and facets of our lives that it can influence or literally touch other people that are closest to us as well. And so I appreciate you sharing. Thank you so much. And I wish the best for you during the anniversary. Okay. Thank you. So I am gonna move, sorry. Okay. So why do secondary losses matter? Secondary losses matter because they do come up, and they come up on our journey as we are going through grief. Um, most of the times, some of these secondary losses or non-death losses, they aren't validated by our peers. Oftentimes they think, you know, you shouldn't feel, oh, you shouldn't be feeling that way. And what happens is when people experience secondary losses, for example, perhaps a loss of income, I think, Tara, you might have mentioned that earlier, you know, we see that as, yes, while there may be a social component where we may need to come up with a way to make up that financial portion that was helping us, with housing or staying alive. But the emotional component, the part that we're still grieving, that we don't have that sense of financial security anymore, that can be pretty scary. That can also be pretty traumatizing. And so it's important to give it space and to allow yourself, right, to feel that it is okay. It's not shameful. While it's scary, even if months have gone by, even if 2 years have gone by, that secondary loss is still felt. And instead of seeing it as this thing that we need to overcome, it's this, hurdle now, it's this thing that we just need to just get over it. Instead, what I'm trying to say is, it's just like another part of the grieving process. It's a thing that we have to process. It's a thing that we have to grieve as well. And so being able to tell people, hey, you know what? I need to be supported and I still need to be validated, because yes, while this might have happened 5 years ago, I'm still picking up my pieces. I'm still picking up myself financially. It still hurts because back then I had that sense of financial security. And today, even 5 years later, I don't. You are totally validated and totally entitled to feel that way, okay? So how do we cope? How do we cope with these secondary losses? How do we cope with these? So being able to talk about it freely, being able to talk to someone that we think that we can be vulnerable with. I will say this, I don't think we can be vulnerable with just anyone. I think wisdom does dictate sometimes there are people that we can be vulnerable with, and other people, they may not be the best person for emotional support. But if you do have that privilege of having someone to lean on for emotional support, it's really, really important to acknowledge what you are feeling, what you're going through, even if these are the thoughts that you're going through. So, okay. So now to get to the part where grief and trauma, or when trauma and grief intersect, and why does it even matter? So trauma in its own will overlap a lot with some of the grief components. And I've often heard people say that trauma and grief are two sides of the same coin. They're part of a very similar experience. You can have trauma once you experience trauma, and there is a saying where you can have trauma and you will typically experience grief, but you can experience grief and not necessarily experience trauma. It's a little confusing, but just stay with me. So when I mentioned earlier, what quote normal grief or uncomplicated grief is, it's typically thought of, yes, you will feel this really deep sense of sadness and perhaps moments of anger, even moments of, just, bouts of what feel maybe like depression. But there is almost a distinction. There is a distinction between grief and complicated grief. And complicated grief, it's when grief becomes persistent and debilitating enough to where it starts to interfere with your everyday living or your everyday life activities. So, for example, it's typically thought of complicated grief. It's typically thought of this prolonged grief for more than a year. And I'm not saying that if your significant other who you absolutely loved and adored, I'm not saying that if you still feel sadness a year after they have passed away, that it is complicated grief. That wouldn't be the case. Complicated grief is a disruption to the normal process of what grieving is, of what healing is. So as we're grieving, we are trying to adapt, at those moments when we feel that, hey, this person is no longer here. Okay, so then we feel the sadness, we go through it, we go through the motions, but then we tend to be able to tolerate some of the positive and negative experiences of that, and we're able to adapt to it. In complicated grief, it's more about having a reaction of negative thoughts or feelings that we have that are associated with that element of the loss. So, for example, we will think about the loss of someone as being preventable. Well, we will think about almost like survivor's guilt in a way where it's like we think that we could have done something to have stopped them from passing away. We focus more almost like on the event and not necessarily the person passing away or the individual. So, so as I mentioned before, grief and trauma do have a tremendous overlap when it comes to having symptoms of trauma and symptoms of grief. Some of the complications to grief, where it's complicated grief, is that the feelings will worsen over time. It can get more intense. Sometimes they get too intense to the point where people just no longer want to get out of bed, even a year or 2 years after the person has passed away, or they've suffered that loss. Typically with complicated grief, you'll see some of the signs or symptoms that almost kind of mimic PTSD. It's in a way, but it's associated to the grief and not an event. So for example, let's say we are consistently thinking or being angry about the person who has passed away, or there's our inability to focus on anything but the loss, excessive avoidance of any reminders of the loss, or intense feelings of sadness, detachment, sorrow, and hopelessness. And then let me just go down the other. Even signs of complicated grief, they could be problems accepting the reality of the loss. I think I mentioned, the guilt or the blame. I could have done something. I should have done something. I wasn't there. Did I do enough? Or when an individual is experiencing complicated grief, they might resort to, self-destructive behaviors such as, drinking or substance use. And sometimes sex gets overlooked, but sex is also another one where people will engage in risky behaviors. And sex is typically one that's overlooked. No shame there, but it is something that if it's out of what you have traditionally done, then just know that can be a sign of us trying to internally cope with grieving, and our natural process of grieving has been interrupted. So, as I mentioned earlier, everyone who experiences trauma also experiences some sort of grief, but not everyone who grieves experiences trauma. It's kind of a little bit of a distinction. So, complicated grief is sometimes considered traumatic grief, but I wanted to highlight a little bit of the differences here, and people do use these terms interchangeably. I would think about complicated grief as the broader term, and traumatic grief kind of more the, more particular specific term to describe what is actually going on. So when there is traumatic grief, what is traumatizing is when we suddenly experience the loss, or when the loss or the death of someone is abrupt, unexpected, it's untimely, often caused by violence, and is usually viewed as unjust, avoidable, or it's the consequence by through the actions of a human. So what that basically is saying is there's an element that typically what is potentially traumatizing when we experience a sudden loss is the idea that the loss is so abrupt. And not only is it abrupt and it's unexpected, it really catches us off guard. There's an added element sometimes that when it's also at the hands of a human, at the act of a malicious human being, that also adds another layer that it's potentially traumatizing. So that's another layer that we have to unravel, that we have to pretty much navigate through therapy. So understanding that if you are experiencing traumatic grief, going to counseling for just grief alone may not be entirely feasible because there is an added layer of trauma to it. And that trauma needs to get addressed before the grieving process can even begin. And so oftentimes, what we'll see with traumatic grief is even after 5 years, individuals will still be able to recall easily how they viewed, that traumatic event when their loved one passed away, or if they were there, how it happened. But it's also comes with this, emotional flooding. It also comes with this sense of sadness. And once again, it's that sense of safety that it's being compromised. And like I said, it's almost like PTSD mixed in with grief. But the thing is that for some academics, they're considering complicated grief or traumatic grief as its own mental illness, or as its own disorder, I guess, because in the DSM, that's the way that they're trying to phrase it, because it hasn't been studied as much as because as we study trauma and PTSD and grief, and it's finally shining a light on, hey, people haven't been able to move on with their grief, and it seems to be that traumatic grieving is one of those components, one of those elements. Am I still good on time? Yeah. In the process, because of time, what I'll do is I'll kind of just summarize this, but when someone is experiencing traumatic grief, they may have intense feelings of fear, helplessness, distressing memories. So they'll have constant flashbacks. Once again, kind of like that PTSD element. They may even shut down emotionally, avoiding thoughts and feelings about the loss. So unable to recall the individual, not being able to tolerate the positives and the negatives of that experience, right? Not being able to process, or not being able to mourn is really what is happening. It's interfering with that act of being able to mourn the individual. And so I also wanted to highlight a little bit about giving space, or giving a highlight to, some of the firsts. For people who have experienced loss, some of the firsts can be very impactful, and they can also be potentially traumatizing. And when we talk about firsts, we mean when we've experienced a loss, we typically see that the firsts are very, very difficult to deal with, are very, very difficult to process, right? It's the first holiday without our loved one that has passed away. It's the first birthday that we're celebrating without our loved one. It's probably somebody's graduation, or the first 3 months, or even the first year. When the first year happened from Pulse, I remember it was one of the biggest ones. It was an event that was, the attendance to some of the events was overwhelming, because it is the first. There's a lot of, it's fresh on everyone's mind, and and the support is still there. But understanding that when we experience this, the firsts can be very, very, very challenging. So understanding that when the first year goes by, it's incredibly hard. And not ideally, but the theory is that after the second year, or after on the second year or the third year, if we are processing things, the grief tends to be a little bit more tolerable, manageable as time goes by. Remember, it's processing, and it's time. When we are dealing with traumatic or complicated grief, it's going to feel, it can even feel sometimes even more intense. And that's not to say that if someone experiences that they're always going to be dealing with traumatic grief, because it also depends on what's going on in each, because everyone's grief is unique. But understanding that can also, the difference is also important. So just some of the things that I wanted to highlight about the LGBTQ community, and some of the things that perhaps don't always get highlighted, because it is a minority group, right? Oftentimes, as I mentioned earlier, you know, the LGBTQ community does deal a lot with disenfranchised grief. It's not fully acknowledged or validated by families or society or workplaces. Sometimes survivors can't go out there and openly say, hey, I was at this Pulse nightclub and I went through this really traumatic event because of perhaps being, even if you were straight, but going to, you know, somewhere where it was where it was a gay club could be stigmatizing and for some people in some communities. So there's that disenfranchised grief. Also understanding that the importance of chosen families in the gay community is really important. Most of a lot of the clients that I've had have been disowned by their families for their sexuality. And the importance of chosen families, these families who basically take them in and will support them and will, you know, help them get started with a roof over their head or somewhere to sleep. That is something that is very, that we see a lot in the gay community is the importance of chosen families. And so sometimes it's not all the time, but sometimes we are not dealing with direct or immediate family members. And that was something that we ran into a lot with Pulse was when it came time to figure out what decisions were to be made is sometimes chosen families wouldn't even enter into the conversation. And that was something that has been very, very hard to deal with. So a lot of as when we talk about losses, a lot of the LGBTQ community also experience non-death losses. And this is the losses when we talk about familial support or spiritual or loss of spiritual communities, right? Some religions are not too friendly or are not accepting of, you know, of sexual or you know, same sex or other sex orientations. And so sometimes there's that loss that a whole community has to grieve. I mentioned a little bit earlier, hidden relationships. One of those things would be that in the gay community, or the LGBTQ community, I should say, oftentimes, even when their partner is in the hospital and perhaps they're in their last moments, sometimes partners are denied entry, you know, because they're expecting, if it's a male, a gay male, they're expecting they're expecting a female to show up, but no, it's a gay man, you know, it's a couple, they're a married couple. And so sometimes that discrimination can also happen. And there is an added layer of that could potentially be traumatizing. That could potentially be adding to your grief because you didn't get a chance to see your loved one or your significant other simply because you were gay or you were part of the LGBTQ community. And other things like identity and intersection of identity and stigma. Sometimes in the LGBTQ community, it's not always accessible for, you know, LGBT community members to access traditional grief support groups. So it can prolong the grieving process, or it can isolate people and increase feelings of isolation and sadness and depression even. Lastly, what I've also seen is, you know, pride-related events and remembrance events, storytelling, art, activism, social justice matters are really, really important to this community. And that is also a way for the community to process that grief. You know, like I said earlier, with Pulse, it was a resounding response that, you know, we weren't going to let hate win. We weren't going to let that determine, you know, we were going to be resilient and we were going to basically bounce back. And a lot of that is something that we have seen throughout with the LGBTQ community as it plays a role in collective healing. So I don't want to talk anyone's ear off anymore, but I have the last slide, and this is just honoring the you know, the Pulse. It's been quite the journey of learning and consistently learning, and an honor and a privilege having worked with this community. And I wanted to thank you, Jill and Alice, for having me today, and I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I really appreciate all the things that you pointed out. You know, it gives us a lot to think about. One of the things, important things that I think you pointed out is that grief is a full body experience. And, you know, I think we know that, but I think it's really good to say it out loud.
Mhm.
And because sometimes people wonder why they're feeling in such a certain way, because they're not necessarily thinking of the loss, but they're feeling it anyway, you know. And I started to think about some of the words that we use for loss. You know, it was heartbreaking, it was gut wrenching,
Yeah.
there were hot tears, we were flooded with emotions. And, you know, for a lot of people who, when they went through this mass violence incident, you know, you're absolutely right. It was abrupt. It was avoidable. It was, it was, it was something that was put on them. So that makes it different. But people who did not experience that, they don't get that.
Yeah.
So that's why when it's so good for those who've been impacted to be able to get together and say, wow, are you feeling this? And it's like, yes, good, you know, because there are others who are feeling the way I'm feeling. I'm not, I'm not going crazy. I am
Yeah.
grieving.
Yeah.
And sometimes that expression of the emotions, because we're not used to expressing our emotions that deeply, it can feel really, really overwhelming. So I appreciate the fact that you said there's no shame in it. It's really good to label the grief, and, you know, and that's either someone or something. And for a lot of people who've gone through mass violence incidents, they've lost their position in the community. You know, they weren't able to focus at work. So now they've got a different career path. And so there's just losses that come up. And like you said, we typically think in uncomplicated grief maybe the first are the hardest. But for some people, they have found, you know, the fifth year was the hardest. Or they were okay one year and then another year that they weren't. And that
Yeah.
can surprise them.
Yeah.
But it is part of the healing process and
Yeah.
the integration.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, and if I can add, sorry, you know, and there's so many other, there are several other types of grief, and one of them is delayed grief. So, you know, sometimes perhaps it's a mom who is making sure that her children or, you know, everyone around her is being taken care of, and so she will sacrifice herself in that regards emotionally to put her family first. And so what you know, what ends up happening is like you push down all these emotions, all these, you know, sad, whatever it is you're feeling, sadness, anger, you literally just, you know, the mom can just push it all down, and it won't pop up till maybe like a year or two or three or five, who knows when it'll come up later. But
yep,
it does come up, and you're absolutely right.
We've
yeah.
even noticed that with the mass violence incidents where people feel like they're okay, they're fine, and then all of a sudden they become much more snappy. You know, acting in ways, you know, even 5, 7, 10 years down the road, acting in ways that they normally wouldn't, and it's because they have that unprocessed grief from the trauma.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I have, you know, even 9 years after Pulse, I have had people tell me, I don't understand why I'm angry all the time. I don't get
Mhm.
it. And it's like we kind of do like a little bit of a full circle, you know, because, well, what's going on? And yes, it's unprocessed. It's these things that we haven't visited. It's these things that we haven't talked about, or maybe they forgot that grief was still happening and they still need to be able to talk about it. But
Mhm.
it's been 9 years, so I shouldn't, you know, I don't want to bother anyone with this. I don't want to burden anyone. You know, my family's already heard me enough, or my friends have already heard me enough. They're tired, they've gone. And it's like, well, no, you still need to tap into that then, because it's that support and being able to label and acknowledge that's when you can start to mourn and also process the grief.
We had somebody added in the chat, grief slash trauma is debilitating, especially when you have layers or compounded grief. And that's so true.
I would 100% agree with that. Yes.
That's, we say all the time,
Yeah.
trauma is cumulative, and it's not, I hate to use just our incident, but it's everything that happened prior to our incidents and then since the incident too.
Yeah. And it is, those layers are very interesting because as not only do you have the grief, but then you also have all that aspect of trauma. So not only was the incident traumatic, but now it's like the reaction to this grief is also traumatic. And so now we have all these compounded, all these layers. It's quite literally multi-layered in that regards. And I'm seeing another comment.
Yeah, so somebody else says they remembered feeling guilty as being angry when they first started grieving the event. And it's a natural human response to have some guilt about the anger, and yet it's valid and important. And somebody else is saying still feeling survivor guilt to this day, and it's still relevant. Absolutely, absolutely, it is still relevant.
Jesse, you mentioned that, several of your clients here get over it, or why aren't you over it? And I know personally, I've heard that, and I know a lot of other survivors. I mean, I think it's just people don't understand that this is a lifetime process.
Mhm.
It's not just hey, it was 5 years ago, it was 8 years ago, it was 10 years ago. And I've even talked to Columbine survivors, and they're at 26 years now.
Oh, wow.
And they start going through the healing process. So it's, please know that for everyone listening, that this is definitely not something that we do just get over, because there's so much of ourselves that we lost during our incident. And that is grief, even if we didn't lose somebody who we knew personally.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because you're still not over it or get over it, or have you not moved on or move on? I mean, that says, I think, more about the other individual in that space and in that moment in time, because it's probably making them uncomfortable, right? And for the most part, it's like, no, no, even if 26 years have gone by, I've heard mom say there is no end to my grieving my child. I will do it for, as long as I live. And that's okay, because it's now a healthier relationship with that grief. However, it is unfair and it is unjust. And I hear that all the time. And I hear it so much from the support group too that we have here for grief and loss. And they hate that sentence. I mean, it's like they want to get up and they want to just like throw something or throw something at someone. But yeah, it is at a disservice.
I try to remind myself when I hear something insensitive like that, that I'm glad they don't understand, because I wouldn't want anybody to experience what we've all experienced. So it's like I try to give them a little bit of grace. It's like, okay, they're saying something that comes across super insensitive because they don't understand, and I'm glad they don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's still
Yeah.
it's hard to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's another comment in the chat, and this is something that we saw a lot of, especially with the Route 91 community, that you could go to the event with a group of friends that you were really close to, and then the incident happens and everybody responds differently. And so for some people, their friends that they went with didn't even validate their grief, because they were coping with it differently. And so it's, so then that becomes part of the secondary losses, that those friendships that you had, you can't even grieve together because you're grieving so differently.
Yeah.
And then that becomes another loss. And so, yeah, it's very complicated. It's very multi-layered Does anyone have any questions for Jesse or any other comments you want to say? Okay, so it looks like everybody's kind of wrapped up.
Yeah.
The ripple effect you mentioned, the ripple effect of a loss,
Well,
and that's just really good.
thank you. Thank you. And I just see two last comments, one about being upset over them trying to erase the memorials for Pulse. Do you mean the crosswalk that the governor's not letting us? Yes, okay. Yeah. So if I don't know if y'all have been keeping up with the news, so Florida, very much like a Florida style, our governor, so at the crosswalk where Pulse is, the site, it was painted in a rainbow color, the crosswalk right where you get to Pulse, it was painted rainbow. And DeSantis decided that he was going to do away with all of that. So in typical, and I'm very excited that our community responded with, well, we're just going to put chalk on it then, because we're going to keep painting it. And it's been about a week and a half, and the community still goes out there and still paints it every single time. And then I think it's like the Florida highway, or they'll come back out there and they'll have to like repaint it and do away with the chalk. And once again, like the community comes out there and re-chalks it. It's been a mess, but yeah, so those are some of the social justices that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then another person had a friend who was in Iraq, and I think she was questioning why he hadn't been over it. It's been 10 years, but as soon as she went through her event, he had commented to her, I'd be hearing from you. And she's like, I get it. You don't ever get over it. It's just who we are now. And that changed my thoughts immediately. And it's true. Until you go through something like this, you're not going to understand.
Right, right.
I mean, I thought I knew what PTSD was, and my first thought was military. I had no idea until, going through my incident and then getting PTSD, having been diagnosed myself.
Yeah.
So I get people not understanding. I just wish there was some way that they could without actually experiencing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and everyone, I would say it also depends on, how many trauma events you've been exposed to. And I think I mentioned that early on, right? If you've, all these variables enter your locus of control, whether you feel like, you have a choice in the events that happen to you or not. Yeah, whether you have good coping mechanisms, all these things can affect that outcome. But yeah, that the idea that once you hear it from someone that they're going through something, grief or death loss, but until you go through it yourself, then that's a whole different beast for sure.
Well, and here's a great example of post-traumatic growth. Thanks to my grief, I've started to learn new boundary making and positive coping skills, and they've been some life habit changing gains. And that definitely can come with grief and loss and traumas too, is the growth.
Mm-hmm.
So, it brought up that some of your clients had mentioned that they thought they had a good life until they started really digging down into it. And I
Mm-hmm.
know several of us have gone through the Triumph Over Tragedy program at Onsite. And that was one thing when I went through it 5 years ago that was just so eye-opening to me, because there's so many things I didn't think of as traumas that I now realize are. And it explains so much of my life and why I've made some of the decisions I have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also, some people are more sensitive than others, and that's why it's so important to differentiate, like, just because that individual might say, you think that's traumatizing, not to you, but to me it is. And that's why the idea that perception is reality, if you perceive it to be, traumatizing, then it is. That's the most important part, is it's that perception of it. And some people were just more sensitive than others. I know I'm super sensitive. So
Yeah.
it's no surprise to me that, and And yeah, as I think Deborah Howell said, so many things contribute to how we feel every day, and it's a, you know, every day is its own day. Yeah,
Absolutely.
you know,
Absolutely. So,
my pleasure. I thank you very much for having me and for, allowing me the space to share. And yeah,
Yes,
thank you so much.
thank you,
Appreciate
Jesse.
it.
Really appreciate your time and your insight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
okay, so real quick, we wanted to remind you guys about the Continuing the Conversation with Heart support groups. We have them the third Tuesday of each month at 4 o'clock Pacific and 7 o'clock Eastern, and the fourth Thursday of each month at 6 o'clock Pacific and 9 o'clock Eastern. So these are for anybody impacted by any mass violence incident. It could be for family, loved ones, because sometimes it does help for them to hear that what we have experienced um, is normal, and it helps to hear from other people. And as Jesse mentioned, support groups are a great way to help process some of what happened to us. And a reminder that all of the integrative services programs offered through the Resiliency and Justice Center are available to anyone impacted by any mass violence incident. So these programs are the Heart Peer Support, where you can be paired one-on-one with one of our trained mentors, our First Tuesdays with Heart program, the Continuing the Conversation with Heart support groups. There is a weekly meditation and mindfulness program, trauma recovery yoga, art therapy, and I just so happen to have mine that I did last week. So this is the form of a neurographic art. So if you haven't heard of it or done any, this is some of the things that we do. And trust me, I can't draw a stick figure, and I was able to do this. So we'd encourage everybody to join and try. It's more about the process and not the end result. And then so all of those are via Zoom, so anyone anywhere can participate. The equine therapy demonstrations are in person in Vegas. So if you happen to be visiting in Vegas, if you don't live there, we'd encourage you to go if they happen to have one while you're visiting. For more information or to register, you go to the Resiliency and Justice Center's website on the calendar. And then real quick, this is just a brief view of some of the things we have going on. The only things that are not open to any mass violence incident are the ones that are event specific. So the Route 91 and UNLV support groups. But other than that, all of these things are open to any mass violence incident. I always like to share additional support. You can be paired with a heart mentor, as I mentioned, at the resiliencyanddjustice.org/heart. Click on request heart peer support. The disaster distress helpline is a 24/7 number that was actually created for people impacted by natural and man-made disasters. So if it's something that you're up in the middle of the night and you have no one to talk to and you're having those intrusive thoughts, you can give them a call and they have somebody who will talk with you. The National Mass Violence Center has some amazing resources, and they also have a virtual resiliency center with more resources. And they have the Transcend NMVC app, which was created in part by people impacted by mass violence. So make sure if you want to download it, you put in Transcend NMVC, National Mass Violence Center, because there are some other Transcend apps. So we want to make sure that we have you on the right one. Um, Always a good one to remember, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. We do, if you haven't joined our First Tuesdays with Heart Facebook page, we do have that. We have people who post some great inspirational memes. Feel free to post them yourself. And then we also we post the recordings, announcement, things like that. And then a fun page we have, since we have to have some fun. We found that cooking can be very grounding for people. So we created a Cooking for Post-Traumatic Growth Facebook page where people can share recipes, ideas, ask for recipes. I see a thumbs up from somebody. So it's a fun place to get new ideas. Next month, we are excited to bring back Molly Duncan. You might remember her from last fall. She and her husband Lindsay talked on trauma and relationships, and she's going to be speaking to us on From Chaos to Clarity, how healthy routines aid in your healing journey. So we so appreciate you guys joining us. have a wonderful night. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Alice or myself or Jesse. And we can, if you have any questions, we can also, if you forgot, where to reach Jesse, we can also get them to him too. So thank you guys so much.